There is a map in the Library of Congress that should not exist. Not in the conspiratorial sense. Not hidden, not suppressed, not locked behind anything. It is available online. You can look at it today on a screen in whatever room you are sitting in right now. It was drawn by a French mathematician named Oronce Fine in 1531, printed in Paris, distributed across Europe, held in libraries for nearly 5 centuries. It is a world map on a cordiform projection, heart-shaped, which was Fine's innovation, a way of wrapping the globe onto a flat surface that he was quite proud of. And at the bottom of that heart, where most maps of the period placed either empty ocean or the vague suggestion of land based on nothing, Fine placed a continent. He gave it mountain ranges. He gave it coastal river systems draining toward the sea. He gave it bays and inlets with a specificity that does not feel like guessing. He labeled it in the Latin that cartographers of his era used for the unknown south, Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, the southern land not yet known. Antarctica was not officially sighted until 1820. The ice sheet that covers its coastline has been accumulating, by the best scientific consensus available, for at least 6,000 years. Fine drew rivers flowing into the sea, where today there is only ice. And when geophysicists flew radar surveys over the continent during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958, they were measuring for the first time the actual shape of the land beneath the ice. What they found corresponded, in its broad contours, to what Oronce Fine had drawn more than 400 years earlier. The southern land, not yet known. Perhaps the first question is not how he knew. Perhaps the first question is, who told him it was not yet known at all? Aristotle wrote about the southern continent in the 4th century BC in a text called the Meteorologica. He was not speculating in the way we might use that word today. He was reasoning geometrically. A sphere, he argued, requires balance. If the inhabited world exists in the northern temperate zone, then there must be a corresponding zone in the south, a region bearing the same relation to the southern pole as the place we live in bears to our pole. He was not describing something he had seen. He was describing something that had to be there. This was not myth. This was mathematics applied to the shape of the world. Ptolemy of Alexandria carried this reasoning further in the 2nd century AD in his Geographic Hyphagesis, the foundational text of Western cartography. He built Aristotle's southern continent into the structure of map-making itself. His maps did not depict it with precision. They could not, but they encoded its necessity. For over 1,000 years, European cartographers drew a landmass in the south because Ptolemy told them it had to be there. They called it Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, and they filled the space with whatever their imaginations or their source materials suggested. What is strange is that Fine's version, drawn in 1531, does not feel like imagination. It feels like information. At the same time that Greek philosophers were working this out from pure geometry in the Mediterranean, something else was happening in the Pacific. Polynesian navigators, working from oral traditions encoded in star charts, wave patterns, and the behavior of birds, were sailing into southern latitudes that European science could not reach until the 18th century. Their navigational tradition spoke of cold southern seas, of ice, of a great silent land at the bottom of the ocean. They did not call it by its Latin name. They did not arrive at it through geometric necessity. They arrived at it by going there. These two traditions, Mediterranean philosophy and Pacific seamanship, had no contact with each other, and they describe the same place. And then Oronce Fine, working in Paris from source maps he did not fully explain, draws a coastline. In 1959, a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire named Charles Hapgood was working in the Library of Congress when he encountered the Phineas map. He later wrote that as his eyes fell upon the southern hemisphere of Fine's world map, He had the instant conviction that he had found a truly authentic map of the real Antarctica. Hapgood and his students spent years comparing the Phineas coastline, corrected for the distortions introduced by the cordiform projection, against the radar surveys of subglacial Antarctica produced during the International Geophysical Year. They identified approximately 50 geographic features: coastal bays, mountain ranges, interior valleys, river systems, features that are not visible from the surface, features that are buried under ice hundreds of meters thick, features that were confirmed by instruments that did not exist when Fine was alive. The Ross Sea appears on the Phineas map as an open gulf. Today, the Ross Sea is covered by a floating ice shelf several hundred meters thick, one of the largest ice shelves on Earth. Sediment cores taken from the Ross Sea floor in 1949, tested at the Carnegie Institute in Washington, yielded deposits of the kind carried by rivers in an area that is now entirely frozen. Those sediments were dated to approximately 4000 BC. In February of 2026, an international research team drilling as part of the SWAIS-2C project pushed through 523 meters of ice at a site called Crary Ice Rise, deep within the Ross Ice Shelf. They extracted a record-breaking sediment core nearly 230 meters long. Inside it, they found shell fragments and the remains of marine organisms that require sunlight to survive, organisms that cannot live under ice. The lead researchers described it plainly. There must have been open ocean here. There must have been a beach. Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, the southern land not yet known. The phrase is beginning to feel imprecise in a specific way. Not yet known by whom, and at what point in time is a question the phrase does not answer. The thing about the Phineas map is that Fine was not the only one. Piri Reis, the Ottoman admiral and cartographer, drew a world map in 1513, 18 years before Fine, that has its own contested southern coastline. Piri Reis wrote annotations on his own map. He was explicit about his sources. He compiled the map from 20 documents, some of which he described as ancient, and some of which he said dated to the time of Alexander the Great. He noted that among his sources was a map by Christopher Columbus, a map that has never been recovered, that exists now only because Piri Reis said he had it, Christopher Columbus's lost map. Somewhere in that chain of sources, someone had information that predates every expedition we have on record. Piri Reis's sources passed through Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria, destroyed across several centuries by fire and neglect and the entropy of institutions, had collected navigational and geographic records from across the ancient world. What survived Alexandria passed into Arabic compilations. What survived those compilations passed, in fragments, into the hands of scholars in the libraries of the Renaissance. Oronce Fine, sitting in Paris in 1531, was working from copies of copies of copies of something. Gerard Mercator, the most famous cartographer of the 16th century, the man whose name we still attach to the projection used in most of the world's maps, compiled an atlas in 1538 that also included a detailed Antarctic coastline. He stated explicitly that he had access to source maps beyond the Phineas map. He did not say where those source maps came from. Perhaps what all of these cartographers held in their hands were the last legible fragments of surveys made when the Ross Sea was navigable, when Antarctic rivers ran to open water, when someone with the means to travel and the knowledge to record sailed far enough south to draw what they found and passed the record forward through institutions that burned and were rebuilt and burned again. Perhaps Terra Australis Nondum Cognita was never really about something unknown. Perhaps it was a label applied, centuries after the fact, to something someone had known and then forgotten how to reach. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility here is not a lost civilization with impossible technology, but something simpler and in some ways more troubling. That someone went there during a window of time when the ice had retreated enough to make it possible drew what they saw with the instruments available to them, and that the record survived in degraded form through every catastrophe that records survive through, imprecise enough to be dismissed, precise enough to match the radar. Terra Australis Nondum Cognita. Not yet known. Perhaps once known. Perhaps the phrase is the label we applied to our own forgetting. All of this might be wrong in ways that matter. Hapgood's work has been substantially contested. The comparison between the Phineas coastline and modern subglacial Antarctica depends on projection corrections that not all cartographers accept, and on a selective identification of matching features that critics argue proves only that if you look hard enough at any old map and any real coastline, you will find correspondences. The feature matching is real, but the interpretation of what it means is not settled. The Ross Sea sediment dates are real, but geologists attribute ice-free conditions in the region to natural climate cycles that operated over tens of thousands and even millions of years, not to any specific window of recent human history. The Suez 2C cores span 23 million years of climate record. They confirm that the Ross ice shelf region has seen open ocean in the past. They do not confirm when exactly, or whether that timing aligns with the period Hapgood needed. The Greeks drew a southern continent not because they had navigational data, but because Aristotle's geometry demanded one. Fine may have drawn his detailed Antarctica by extrapolating from the tip of South America, seen by Magellan just 11 years before his map, and guessing at the shape of whatever lay further south. Mapmakers of the period did not tolerate empty space. They filled it with coastlines, with mountains, with rivers, because a map with a blank southern ocean felt incomplete. Sometimes they guessed correctly. That is not the same thing as knowing. Perhaps the source maps Peary Race described were not ancient navigational surveys, but philosophical speculations, geographic reasoning rather than geographic observation, passed forward through the same chain of libraries and compilations, gaining the appearance of specificity through successive copying and reinterpretation. Perhaps the convergences in this account are the convergences that any sufficiently motivated analysis will find. The mind is very good at finding patterns. That too is well documented. But the uncertainty does not erase the map. The Oronce Fine map is in the Library of Congress. The cordiform projection is real. The continental outline is real. The river systems are real. The sediment cores are real. The radar surveys are real. The correspondence between the Phineas coastline and the subglacial topography is real, at least in its broad contours, at least enough that serious researchers have taken it seriously. What that means is that we cannot say with any precision where Fine got his information. We cannot follow the chain of source maps back to its origin. We cannot close the gap between what the map shows and what anyone in 1531 should have been able to draw. And that is, perhaps, the more unsettling condition. Not a mystery with a hidden answer, but a mystery with a missing one. The Oronce Fine map is available online. Fine drew it in 1531, distributed it across Europe, and then died in 1555, 40 years before anyone seriously challenged the existence of a southern continent and 265 years before anyone officially cited it. He drew a heart-shaped world, and at the bottom of that heart, he placed a landmass with interior mountain ranges and coastal rivers, and a gulf that would later be identified as the Ross Sea. He labeled it in Latin and moved on to other work, apparently without understanding what he had drawn or where it had come from. We have the radar now. We have the sediment cores and the geophysical surveys and the instruments that can see through ice. We know what is under the frozen surface of the continent, and what is under that surface corresponds, in its broad contours, to a map drawn by a mathematician who had never been further south than Paris. The phrase he used, Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, the southern land not yet known, appears on maps across 2 centuries of European cartography. It was a placeholder, a label for an absence, a name given to a space that reason demanded be filled, pressed into copper, and printed in 6 languages, and distributed across the literate world as an admission that something was there. Something the map makers could not reach. Something at the bottom of the globe that was waiting to be found. What the Phineas map suggests, without proving, is that the not yet may have been inaccurate from the beginning. That the knowing may have happened first, and the forgetting came after, and the rediscovery came last, and that what we call discovery is sometimes only the moment when the record finally catches up to something that was written down once, long ago, by someone who had been there and then was not remembered. The map is still in the library. The ice is still over the rivers. And somewhere in the gap between what Oronce Fine drew and what anyone in 1531 could have known, there is a question that the sediment cores have made more uncomfortable, not less. The southern land not yet known by us, or not yet known again.